Etta Reeves stood at the edge of Miners Hollow, a small town nestled in the shadow of rugged mountains. Life here was not easy. Dust coated everything from the saloon doors to the weathered faces of its inhabitants. Etta had grown up in this unforgiving landscape, where dreams often withered as quickly as wildflowers in a drought. Yet she had always resisted being molded by her surroundings, striving for something better despite her circumstances. Her marriage to Hank Reeves had begun with promise, a whirlwind romance fueled by youthful optimism. But that sweetness faded faster than Etta could have imagined. As years passed, Hank's charm crumbled, revealing a man consumed by his vices. Gambling debts spiraled endlessly, and bottles of whiskey became his closest companions. The once affectionate husband transformed into a tyrant, leaving bruises on both Etta's skin and spirit. In a town where silence reigned like an iron fist, few spoke against him. He lived above the law and wielded his power over those too afraid to resist. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily upon Etta and other women who felt trapped beneath the weight of societal expectations and fear. They were born into a world that told them to be quiet, to endure. As she navigated her daily life among hushed conversations and sidelong glances, Etta knew she was not alone in her suffering. There were whispers among women in the shadows, mothers, daughters, sisters, who shared stories of pain but lacked the courage to confront their oppressors head-on. Little did they know that one fateful day would ignite their long-simmering frustrations into flames of revolt as Etta made a decision that would change everything forever. The midday sun hung high over Miners Hollow, casting long shadows that stretched across the dusty street like the memories of countless unspoken truths. Etta stood at the entrance of the saloon, her heart thundering in her chest as she watched Hank swagger out, laughter spilling from his lips, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He was buoyed by whiskey and triumph, surrounded by a group of men who cheered his bravado, showing no regard for the bruised lives he left in his wake. The air crackled with tension as Etta took a step forward, her resolve hardening with each heartbeat. She could feel every eye in the town on her, silent witnesses to an act that would shatter their complacency. Half a dozen women stood behind Etta, their own anguish reflected in her determined stance. They had all suffered under Hank's reign of terror, and this moment had been waiting to ignite like dry kindling. Etta, one voice whispered from the crowd, but it faded into the cacophony surrounding Hank. With a deep breath, she withdrew a revolver from her coat, a desperate act born of years of pain and fear. The sheriff, standing nearby with a furrowed brow, felt a chill run through him but did nothing to intervene. In that instant, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Etta raised the gun, her hands steady despite the trembling within. "Hank," she shouted, her voice slicing through the noise. In an instant that felt eternal, she pulled the trigger twice. The deafening reports echoed across Miners Hollow as Hank's laughter stopped abruptly. He crumpled to the ground, eyes wide with disbelief and shock, a terrifying end that marked the beginning of chaos. Gasps broke out among onlookers, some stumbled back while others remained rooted in place, spellbound by the brutal rupture of their ordinary lives. Etta stood there amid stunned silence, adrenaline coursing through her veins as reality enveloped them all. The town would never be the same again. As the echoes of gunfire faded, Sheriff Tom Granger stood frozen at the scene, a mix of shock and turmoil brewing within him. He was a man of the law, sworn to protect his town and uphold justice, yet this moment thrust him into a moral quagmire. Etta's act of violence was undeniable, a brazen crime witnessed by all, yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was not just a case of murder but a reaction to years of torment. Tom knew Hank Reeves well. Like many in Miners Hollow, he had seen the man at his best and worst. He had listened to the complaints about Hank's drunkenness and violence, yet he had done little to intervene. It was an unspoken truth that loomed large over the sheriff's conscience. He often found himself enforcing the law while turning a blind eye to the very human stories behind the crimes, stories like Etta's. A deep sigh escaped his lips as silence fell over the street. The townsfolk, once animated by Hank's bravado, now remained in frozen shock, their eyes darting between Etta and Hank's crumpled form. Would they see Etta as a murderer or a hero? The sheriff could not help but feel the weight of expectation as men began to murmur about justice, while women exchanged glances laden with understanding and defiance. In that moment, Tom faced an impossible choice: uphold the law without considering the circumstances, or listen to the pulse of a town transforming before his eyes. He felt torn between duty and empathy, knowing that how he responded would either maintain order or ignite further unrest in Miners Hollow. As he stepped forward into the chaos, he understood that this pivotal moment would shape his life and his town for years to come. The silence that followed the gunshots morphed into a cacophony of hushed whispers as townsfolk struggled to process the chaos. Some men, driven by an ingrained sense of justice, began to murmur about consequences, their faces etched with disbelief. They had all known Hank and his vices, gambler, drunkard, woman-beater, and yet Etta's actions stirred a cocktail of anger and fear. Deep down, many felt sympathy for her plight, but were hesitant to voice any support in a society that typically blamed women for their circumstances. Meanwhile, a group of women gathered at the edge of the crowd, their expressions reflecting something deeper than mere shock. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a kinship forged through shared suffering. Eyes gleamed with a fierce defiance as they whispered about finally breaking free from the oppressive norms that had kept them silent for too long. For many, Etta's act was not merely murder. It was an act of rebellion against the tyranny they each faced in their own homes. An elder woman stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she began to shout encouragement for Etta. She had to do it. No one else would stop him. Her words resonated through the crowd like a touchstone, igniting passionate debates about justice and morality. Would the law serve as hammer or shield? The atmosphere thickened with tension as men argued that Etta deserved punishment while women rallied for her freedom. As Sheriff Granger observed the tumultuous scene unfold before him, he felt torn more than ever. The community stood at a precipice, a shift toward demanding change or clinging to traditional views of justice that could ultimately lead to further division in Miners Hollow. Each passing moment seemed to weave a tapestry of conflicting emotions that would forever alter their lives and the town they called home. The sun dipped low in the sky as Etta Reeves was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. Sheriff Tom Granger walked beside her, his heart a tumultuous storm of conflicting emotions. The townspeople had gathered, their gazes fixed on Etta with a mix of curiosity, disdain, and sympathy. For some, she was a criminal, for others, a reluctant heroine who had finally stood up against tyranny. As they approached the makeshift holding cell at the town hall, Etta's mind swirled with thoughts of Hank, moments of laughter now tarnished by the violent reality of their lives together. She felt hollow yet resolute, understanding that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. In those quiet moments, she replayed the scene outside the saloon in her mind, wrestling with the fear and adrenaline that had propelled her to pull the trigger. The initial legal proceedings commenced swiftly. The sheriff had little choice but to act. Men in the town, fueled by a desire for retribution, demanded swift justice. They spoke of accountability and law, their voices rising in fervor as they called for Etta's punishment. Yet among them were women who whispered words of encouragement, their expressions filled with empathy and understanding. "She did what many of us wish we could," one woman murmured to another, her eyes glistening with tears. As Etta faced charges of murder, her emotional state fluctuated between despair and defiance. She knew she would be judged not only for her actions but for daring to disrupt the status quo. The trial loomed ahead like an ominous cloud, promising to expose the raw wounds of Miners Hollow and force its inhabitants to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, gender roles, and the nature of rebellion. With each passing day, Etta's fate became more entwined with that of the town itself, a microcosm of conflict and change that threatened to erupt at any moment. The day of Etta Reeves' trial dawned ominously, clouds hanging low over Miners Hollow like the heavy anticipation in the air. The courthouse was a modest structure, its weathered wooden facade echoing the town's own struggles. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tension as townspeople filled the benches, eager to witness the proceedings that would once again divide their community. The judge presiding over the trial was Judge Harold Finch, a man whose once steady hand now trembled under the gravity of his role. He had practiced law in Miners Hollow for over 2 decades, but faced a case that threatened to shatter the very foundation of his understood justice. As he entered the courtroom, silence fell and all eyes turned to him, a mixture of respect and fear evident in his demeanor. Little did they know, Finch harbored his own doubts about the system he was sworn to uphold. Etta's defense attorney, Clara Donnelly, was a firebrand known for her passionate arguments and unwavering commitment to women's rights. Clara saw this trial not just as a defense of her client, but as a pivotal moment that could illuminate the systemic injustices faced by women like Etta. Determined to portray Etta not as a murderer, but as a woman driven to desperation, Clara meticulously prepared her case, rallying support from the women in town who viewed Etta's actions as a symbol of defiance against abuse. Opposing them was District Attorney James Thornton, a staunch traditionalist who believed in strict adherence to the law. His reputation for seeking swift justice clashed violently with the sympathetic narratives emerging from Etta's supporters. Thornton sought not only a conviction but to maintain the status quo, his gaze fixed on controlling a narrative that could easily spiral into chaos. As the trial began, emotions simmered beneath the surface. Hope from supporters of Etta, anger from those demanding retribution, and fear from Judge Finch, whose rulings would soon set the course for both Etta's fate and the future of Miners Hollow. With each testimony and argument presented, the courtroom became more than a place for legal proceedings. It transformed into a battleground for conflicting beliefs about justice, morality, and the rights of women in a harsh world. As the trial unfolded, the men of Miners Hollow found themselves grappling with their own definitions of justice, heavily influenced by tradition and a deep-seated desire for order. Many viewed Etta's act of violence through a lens of retribution, believing that only punishment could restore the balance that had been disrupted. They saw the need to uphold the law as a bulwark against chaos, arguing that if Etta were excused for her actions, it would set a dangerous precedent, allowing emotions to dictate justice rather than reason. In the saloon after the shooting, conversations erupted among the men, their voices rising in fervor. "She shot him in cold blood," one man exclaimed, echoing sentiments shared by others who felt compelled to defend the sanctity of law and order. They believed that holding Etta accountable was necessary not just for Hank, but for all men in the town who feared that this incident could embolden women to take matters into their own hands. They spoke fervently about justice being blind, yet underneath lay a fear that acknowledging Etta's motives would undermine their own authority. However, there were whispers among those who dared to question this rigid viewpoint. Some men hesitated to condemn Etta outright, reflecting a growing awareness of the complexities surrounding domestic violence. They began to see her not just as a murderer, but as a woman pushed to her limits. Perhaps they even recognized echoes of their own failures to address such issues in their lives. Yet these thoughts were often drowned out by louder voices clamoring for punishment. As testimonies unfolded in court, the divide became apparent. The prosecution's arguments focused on Etta's crime, while those sympathetic to her plight raised questions about the circumstances that led to that moment outside the saloon. In this charged environment, discussions of justice morphed into deeper reflections on morality and accountability, a subtle shift that hinted at a broader transformation within Miners Hollow, one that threatened to challenge established norms and ignite change. As Etta's trial progressed, a palpable wave of courage surged among the women of Miners Hollow. They began to gather in groups, their voices rising in unity, desperate to make their experiences heard. The oppressive silence that had long surrounded domestic violence was finally beginning to crack, giving way to calls for revolution. Led by Clara Donnelly, Etta's fierce defense attorney, these women recognized that Etta's act was not just about her own struggle, but a galvanizing moment for all those who had suffered in silence. In meeting halls and back porches, whispering discussions transformed into passionate speeches. Women recounted their own stories of abuse and oppression, no longer fearful of the judgment that had once silenced them. "Etta represents us," one woman exclaimed during a gathering outside the courthouse, her face flushed with determination. "If she can stand up to her tormentor, then so can we." This urgency echoed through the hearts of many, inspiring them to throw off their roles as passive victims and demand change. With signs emblazoned with phrases like "No more silence" and "Stand with Etta," they marched together, their camaraderie evident as they made their way toward the courthouse. Their presence proved impossible to ignore, and even some men who had previously condemned Etta began to feel the weight of responsibility for their inaction. Within the courtroom walls, whispers of support spilled over into the trial proceedings. When witnesses were summoned to testify about Hank's brutality, nods of affirmation rippled through the crowd. It was a moment that spotlighted a burgeoning awareness. Justice was not merely about legal punishment, but about confronting systemic injustices that had long been hidden beneath the surface. As the town faced the grim realities of Etta's actions, what unfolded was more than a trial. It became a platform for change. Women rallied around Etta not just for her defense, but as a declaration against decades of silence and subservience. With each passing day, it was clear that this firestorm could potentially reshape perceptions and pave the way for a new era for women in Miners Hollow. Judge Harold Finch sat at the bench, his gavel resting heavily in front of him, embodying the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, a palpable clash of expectations radiating from both sides of the aisle. On one hand, the men demanded justice, swift and uncompromising, insisting that Etta Reeves be punished for her crime. On the other, women rallied for understanding, highlighting the systemic abuse that had driven Etta to pull the trigger. Finch could feel the eyes of the community upon him, each gaze filled with hope or fear. These were not just legal proceedings. They were a reflection of the town's pulse, and he was acutely aware that whatever decision he rendered would echo through Miners Hollow for generations. He feared that a ruling in favor of punishment might stifle the burgeoning voices of change among women, yet he also understood that failing to uphold the law could lead to chaos and further division. Each day brought new testimonies, each one adding layers to Etta's story, revealing the desperation and torment behind her actions. As he listened to accounts from friends and neighbors detailing Hank's brutality, Finch felt an internal struggle. The law dictated one path, yet humanity urged another. The tension grew as he contemplated how to deliver justice without quashing the movement that Etta's actions had ignited. In moments of quiet reflection, Finch grappled with his own biases and fears. He had long upheld the law as an unyielding foundation, but now it felt like a fragile construct, susceptible to the shifting dynamics of social change. Torn between maintaining order and acknowledging the cries for revolution, he realized that his rulings could either uphold a broken system or help dismantle it. Every ruling he made became not just a question of legality, but a decision about what kind of future Miners Hollow would embrace. A future defined by silence, or one where voices could finally rise against oppression. As the trial date approached, tensions in Miners Hollow began to escalate, fracturing the community along deep lines of ideology and emotion. Outside the courthouse, groups of men vociferously demanded retribution, their voices echoing through the streets like a war cry for justice. Believing that Etta's actions threatened the very fabric of their societal norms, they organized protests to demand her punishment, asserting that lawlessness could not be tolerated. In stark contrast, women rallied together in growing numbers, their collective voice rising against years of oppression. They held meetings in homes and community centers, discussing not only Etta's plight, but also their own experiences with domestic abuse. Signs emblazoned with powerful slogans such as "Enough is enough" and "We will be heard" became common sights around town, signaling a shift that could no longer be ignored. The air was charged with a sense of urgency and determination as they prepared for a rally that would coincide with the trial. Fractured conversations filled the corners of local establishments as patrons discussed Etta's actions. Men expressed anger at the perceived threat to their authority, while women shared stories of strength and resilience in the face of violence. The sheriff found himself walking a tightrope, caught between these opposing forces, his role as enforcer of the law now clouded by his awareness of the pain that had long been silenced. As protesters clashed with supporters outside the courthouse on the day of Etta's trial, it became evident that this was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a battle for the soul of Miners Hollow. The community stood at a crossroads, heightened emotions pouring into the streets, a potent mix of fear, hope, anger, and solidarity swirling together as they awaited the unfolding drama inside. Every rally, every protest amplified the stakes of the trial, transforming it into a pivotal moment that would define not just Etta's fate, but the future dynamics of power and gender within the town. As Etta Reeves took the stand, a heavy silence enveloped the courtroom. All eyes were fixed on her, a mix of curiosity and judgment swirling in the air. Etta felt the weight of her decision pressing down as she prepared to share her truth. Her heart raced, but beneath the fear was a flicker of resolve. This was her moment to speak, not just for herself, but for all the women who had suffered in silence. With a deep breath, she began recounting the years of torment at the hands of her husband, Hank. He wasn't always this way, she stated softly, her voice trembling. I loved him once, but the man I married turned into a monster. As she spoke, she painted a vivid picture of their life together, Hank's charm fading into darkness, drowning in alcohol and gambling. She described nights filled with his rage and violence, moments when he would belittle her and make her feel powerless. Tears welled in her eyes as she revealed how isolated she had felt, living in fear and shame while society turned a blind eye. I tried to be strong, she continued, her voice gaining strength. But every time I thought about leaving, I remembered the threats he made, how he said he would find me no matter where I went. The courtroom hung on her every word, captivated by the courage it took to expose such raw vulnerability. Etta's testimony became a catalyst for change, igniting conversations that echoed throughout Miners Hollow. She laid bare the truth behind her actions, the culmination of years of suffering that led to that fateful moment outside the saloon. I didn't want to kill him, she confessed, but I wanted to stop the cycle of violence. Her words resonated deeply with the women in the audience, many nodding in solidarity as they recognized their own struggles reflected in her story. As Etta stepped down from the stand, the tension in the courtroom shifted. A collective realization emerged that justice could not merely be about punishment, but understanding the deeper issues surrounding abuse. In that moment, Etta had transformed from an accused woman into a powerful symbol of resistance against oppression, irrevocably altering the course of her trial and the town's perception of domestic violence. As the trial continued, a diverse array of townsfolk stepped forward to share their testimonies, transforming the courtroom into a crucible for collective pain and reflection. With each account, the realities of domestic violence became increasingly undeniable, peeling away layers of silence that had long shrouded Miners Hollow. First was Clara Johnson, a middle-aged woman whose voice trembled as she recounted her own harrowing experiences with an abusive partner. For years I lived in fear, she said, fighting back tears. Every time I thought about speaking up, I remembered my children watching, knowing they were scared of their own father. Her testimony resonated deeply among the women present, many nodding in solidarity as they recognized their shared struggles. Next, Harold Thompson, a respected member of the community and a former friend of Hank, took the stand. His demeanor was tense as he described witnessing Hank's escalating violence over the years and the twisted loyalty that kept him silent about it. We all knew what he was, he confessed. But we kept our heads down because that's how things were, because it didn't happen to us. His admission sparked murmurs in the courtroom. There was recognition that complicity also played a role in the culture of silence. As stories unfolded, each joining together like threads in a tapestry, more voices emerged. Daughters who had felt powerless under their father's heavy hand, mothers recounting their struggles to protect their families while fearing for their lives. The atmosphere thickened with emotional weight and shared grief. It became clear that Etta's struggle transcended her individual case. The culmination of these raw testimonies prompted an awakening within the audience and beyond, forcing both men and women to reckon with their roles in perpetuating cycles of abuse. As emotional barriers fell one after another, it became increasingly apparent that this trial was not just about Etta's actions, but about dismantling a long-standing culture that had suffocated countless voices. The winds of change were blowing through Miners Hollow, a revolution born from pain and resilience, and here, in this courtroom, light began to break through the cracks of darkness that had held sway for too long. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Harold Finch prepared to announce the verdict in Etta Reeves' trial. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of hope and dread, reflective of the deep divisions within Miners Hollow. On one side sat supporters who had rallied behind Etta, their faces filled with anticipation, while on the other, men who demanded justice for her crime, their expressions hardened by years of societal expectations. As Finch took his seat and cleared his throat, silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers. The weight of the moment pressed upon him. His ruling would not only determine Etta's fate, but could also symbolize a shift in the town's values. He glanced at Etta, who sat anxiously beside her attorney, Clara Donnelly, her hands clasped tightly together. The court finds the defendant Etta Reeves, he began slowly, searching for the right words amidst the chaotic emotions swirling around him, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, and reactions ranged from nods of relief among Etta's supporters to disbelief and outrage from those seeking retribution. The verdict challenged the traditional notions of justice that dominated Miners Hollow. To some, it validated Etta's actions as a response to years of oppression and violence. To others, it represented a dangerous precedent that could lead to lawlessness. Outside the courthouse, chants erupted from women rallying for empowerment and justice, while frustrated men voiced their anger at what they perceived as a failure to uphold moral order. In that climactic moment, Finch understood how this ruling might reshape conversations about domestic violence within the community. As Etta embraced Clara, tears streaming down her face in disbelief, it became clear that this verdict marked more than just freedom for one woman. It signaled a potential turning point in the fight against abuse and the roles women played in shaping their own destinies. The echoes of the verdict reverberated throughout Miners Hollow, igniting discussions that would ripple far beyond the trial, forcing people to confront their complicity and paving the way for a future where voices could no longer be silenced. In the aftermath of Etta Reeves' trial, life in Miners Hollow bore the marks of both transformation and lingering resentment. The verdict had ignited a cultural shift, granting many women the courage to share their own stories of abuse and oppression. Community meetings became more frequent, where voices that were once hushed began to resonate with strength and purpose. Women organized support groups, fostering an environment where they could discuss their experiences without fear of judgment, an empowering step towards healing and solidarity. However, not all responses were positive. Many men in the town felt threatened by this newfound assertiveness among women. They viewed Etta's acquittal as a challenge to traditional masculinity and authority, fueling anger and resistance among those who believed justice had been undermined. Bar conversations turned into heated debates about the implications of Etta's actions, with some arguing that her behavior could embolden others to take matters into their own hands. These sentiments created a rift that echoed throughout the town. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom Granger found himself navigating this evolving landscape with trepidation. He witnessed both progress and pushback as he tried to maintain order while grappling with his own beliefs about justice and accountability. His role had transformed from merely enforcing the law to mediating a community in flux, raising concerns over how he would respond to future incidents of domestic violence. Despite these tensions, Etta's story became a focal point for change, a symbol of resilience against long-standing oppression. Her name was spoken not just in whispers, but also in calls for reform that rippled through Miners Hollow. Awareness campaigns emerged, illustrating the need for resources such as shelters and counseling services for survivors of domestic violence. As time passed, it became increasingly clear that Etta's decision to confront her circumstances had sparked a broader dialogue about gender roles and societal expectations. The path ahead remained fraught with challenges, yet the willingness of many to engage in uncomfortable conversations offered hope for healing and progress within a town striving for a new identity amid its tumultuous past. In the months following Etta Reeves' trial, the landscape of Miners Hollow transformed dramatically as the community grappled with the implications of her actions and the subsequent verdict. For many women, Etta became a beacon of hope, prompting a surge in discussions surrounding domestic violence and empowerment. Support groups flourished, providing safe spaces where women could share their experiences without fear, fostering a sense of solidarity that had long been suppressed. However, not everyone was ready to embrace this change. Many men in the town remained resentful, feeling that their authority was being undermined by the burgeoning movement for women's rights. Bar conversations often erupted into arguments, reflecting their anxiety over shifting gender dynamics. Some men argued that Etta's acquittal had set a dangerous precedent, believing it could inspire others to act violently under the guise of justified rebellion. This fear stoked further divisions within the community. Sheriff Tom Granger struggled with his role in this evolving environment. His attempts to mediate between factions showcased his dilemma. Should he enforce traditional notions of justice or acknowledge the systemic issues laid bare by Etta's case? As he witnessed the growing unrest, he realized that his position as law enforcer also required him to advocate for necessary changes in how domestic violence was addressed in Miners Hollow. Despite these tensions, conversations about resources for survivors began to gain traction. Activists emerged within the community advocating for shelters and counseling services, initiatives previously considered too audacious or radical. The echoes of Etta's story spurred a generation of women to reconsider their positions and speak out against the silence that had suffocated them for so long. As Miners Hollow navigated this tumultuous period, it became clear that while Etta's actions had sparked significant discourse on gender equality and justice, they had also revealed deep-seated misunderstandings and fears that would need to be addressed if true change were to take root. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, yet it illuminated a potential future where voices once silenced could rise together in pursuit of justice and dignity for all.